During his wedding, the millionaire froze when he realized the waitress was his wife, who disappeared 11 years ago. He approached her and, "I'd like to ask you to subscribe to our channel. Thank you." The luxurious ballroom of the city's most prestigious hotel was a masterpiece of opulence, a setting where every detail was designed to impress. Crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over the tables, adorned with white roses and fine porcelain dinnerware. The guests, business and political elites, laughed with champagne in hand while photographers captured the night that would seal the union of two of the most powerful families. Richard Evans, the man at the center of it all, exuded absolute perfection. His black tuxedo was immaculate, his hair meticulously styled, his practiced smile unwavering, his posture dominant. Everything about him radiated power and control, yet inside, something felt out of place. From the moment he had stood at the altar beside Elizabeth Wilson, the woman he was about to marry, an uneasy feeling had gnawed at him. It wasn't nerves or regret. He had no doubts about his marriage. Elizabeth was the perfect wife, beautiful, sophisticated, from a family that aligned with his company's interests. And yet, an unsettling thought clung to the back of his mind like a persistent shadow. Then, it happened. Amid the buzz of the celebration, as waiters moved back and forth with trays of champagne, his gaze locked onto a familiar face. His breath caught. Time slowed. A waitress, dressed in a crisp black and white uniform, carried a tray in both hands as she weaved through the guests. Her hair was neatly tied in a simple bun, with no jewelry, no makeup to make her stand out, nothing that should have drawn his attention. And yet, Richard felt as if the ground had been ripped from beneath him. It was her, Sophia, the woman who had vanished 11 years ago. His heart pounded so violently in his chest that he thought it might explode. His hands trembled, and the champagne flute slipped from his grasp, shattering into 1,000 pieces on the floor. The sound cut through the festive atmosphere. Some guests turned their heads, but Richard heard nothing. His entire world had shrunk to the figure moving quickly through the room, eyes lowered, oblivious to his presence, as if she didn't know him, as if they had never shared a life together. But he knew her. Every feature, every curve of her face, the way her lips quivered slightly when she was nervous, the posture that betrayed a quiet urgency. There was no mistake. For a brief moment, Sophia lifted her gaze, and their eyes met. Richard saw the shift in her expression, the tension in her eyes, the raw fear on her face. She had recognized him, too. And then, she ran. She turned abruptly and rushed toward the back exit of the ballroom. Instinct took over. His legs moved before his mind could process what was happening. He shoved a chair aside, dodged a waiter, pushed past guests without caring who saw him. But a hand clamped onto his arm before he could reach the door. "Richard, what are you doing?" It was Elizabeth, his fiancée. The music continued playing, the cameras kept flashing, but Richard felt his entire world collapsing. "I need to step out for a moment," he said, his voice unsteady. Whispers spread through the crowd. Some exchanged confused glances, others watched with curiosity, but Elizabeth didn't let go. "What's going on? Who is that woman?" Richard yanked his arm free. "It's nothing," he muttered, and without giving her time to react, he pushed through the door. The staff corridor was dimly lit, the cold fluorescent lights casting eerie shadows. Richard looked left and right. She was gone. Impossible. He moved quickly, turning corners, pushing open a back door, stepping outside into the cool night air. Empty. There was no one. Returning to the ballroom, his heart pounded in his throat, struggling to catch his breath. His mind oscillated between euphoria and confusion. Sophia was alive. After 11 years of finding no trace, of sleepless nights wondering what had happened to her, after hiring investigators and chasing every possible lead, there she was. And she had disappeared again. His phone vibrated in his pocket. With trembling hands, he pulled it out and looked at the screen. An anonymous message. "Leave the past where it is, or you will lose everything." A chill ran down Richard's spine. This wasn't a coincidence. Someone else knew the truth. Someone else was pulling the strings in this game. But he wasn't going to stop. Not this time. Before we continue with the story, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to our channel. Thank you." The echo of his own footsteps reverberated against the pavement as Richard hurried down the street behind the grand event hall, his breath ragged, his eyes scanning every shadow for Sophia. His Sophia. The woman he had believed dead was now running from him as if he were a stranger, as if the mere sight of him filled her with terror. His chest burned with a mix of disbelief and desperation, every heartbeat hammering against his ribs as if his body itself were warning him, "Don't let her escape again." The alley was dark, neon signs flickering weakly over dumpsters and locked service doors. Everything was still, but Richard knew she was there. He could feel it. And then he caught the faint trace of perfume. Light, delicate, unmistakable. No matter how many years had passed, he would never forget that scent. Then he saw her, a few meters away, pressed against the wall, her chest rising and falling in frantic rhythm, her wide eyes filled with fear. "Sophia." His voice came out rougher than expected, as if something inside him was tearing apart. She flinched and turned her face toward him. The look in her eyes was a dagger straight to his chest. No surprise, no recognition, no relief. Only pure panic. "Don't call me that," she whispered, her voice barely a breath of air. Her pupils dilated as if she were staring at a ghost. Richard took a cautious step forward, afraid that any sudden movement would make her vanish again. "Why are you running from me?" His words were meant to be gentle, but the desperation leaked through. "I don't know you," she said, her entire body rigid, tense like a wire about to snap. Lies. He saw it in her eyes, in the way her breath hitched, in the slight tremor of her hands, as if her mind was fighting against a memory she didn't want to surface. "I'm Richard, your husband," he insisted, his throat tightening with the weight of those words, because no matter how many times he said it, she still refused to acknowledge it. She pressed her lips together, shook her head, and without meeting his eyes, said firmly, "My name is Isabella Garcia." Richard frowned, repeating the name in his head, trying to make sense of it. But deep in his soul, he knew there was no mistake. The woman standing before him, the woman pretending not to know him, was Sophia. "No, you are Sophia. My Sophia," his voice cracked slightly, but the certainty in his gaze remained unshaken. Sophia swallowed hard, her jaw clenched, her fists tightening at her sides. For a moment, she looked as if she might say something, but instead, she turned and bolted toward the main avenue. Richard reacted instantly. His pulse roared in his ears as adrenaline surged through his veins like liquid fire. He couldn't lose her again. Whatever was happening, whoever had erased her past, none of it mattered. He had to reach her. He saw her slip into a crowded crosswalk. If she made it any farther, she would disappear into the night. He picked up speed and, with a quick movement, grabbed her arm, firm but careful not to hurt her. She froze. Her breath was uneven, her chest rising and falling erratically, her skin cold beneath his touch. But what truly unsettled Richard was the way her pupils widened, as if something long buried had just cracked open inside her mind. "If you really don't know me," he said, his voice steady but charged with intensity, "then why do your eyes say otherwise?" Sophia turned her gaze away, her throat bobbing as she swallowed. Her entire body radiated inner turmoil, like something was clawing its way out, forcing her to remember a truth she didn't want to face. Then, suddenly, a sharp gasp of pain left her lips. Her hand shot to her temple, her fingers pressing against it as if something inside her head was breaking apart. Richard's concern eclipsed his frustration. "What's wrong?" His tone shifted from demanding to protective. Sophia squeezed her eyes shut, her breathing turning shallow, her legs unsteady. Blurred images flickered through her mind. A black car, voices, a scream, pain, a dark silhouette approaching. The fear struck her like a tidal wave. Richard saw the sheer terror in her face and felt a shiver run down his spine. "Sophia, tell me what you remember," he urged, but she barely managed to meet his gaze before pushing him away with all her strength and running off once more. He stood frozen, his hands still reaching out, his breath ragged, his chest burning with frustration. Then, his phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out and glanced at the screen. An anonymous message. Leave the past where it is, or you will lose everything. His throat tightened. He read the message again, his pupils dilating with fury, his jaw clenching with unbearable tension. Someone knew what was happening. Someone had wanted Sophia gone from his life. And now, they wanted to stop him from finding her again. That night, as he sat in his office, Richard picked up his phone and called his head of security, his voice edged with raw determination. Find her. Track down who hired her. I want to know where she has been all these years. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Sir, there are no records of her. No contract under her name, not with the catering service, not with the hotel. Richard felt a chill creep down his spine. That's impossible. I saw her with my own eyes. Sir, it's as if she was never there. A thick silence followed, heavy and suffocating, like a dark cloud settling over him. Richard ended the call, his fingers gripping the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a message. Sophia hadn't just disappeared from his life. Someone had tried to erase her very existence. But now that he had found her, he wasn't stopping until he knew the truth. Richard sat in his office, the phone still in his hand, his breath heavy, his thoughts spinning in endless circles. What his head of security had just told him made no sense. Sophia had been there. He had seen her with his own eyes, had touched her skin, had felt the desperation in her gaze. And now, suddenly, there was no record of her presence at the event. It was as if she had been a ghost, a mirage designed to confuse and torment him. But Richard didn't believe in coincidences. He turned on his computer and typed in the name she had given him. Isabella Garcia. He searched databases, employment records, social media. Nothing. Just a handful of references from temporary jobs in the past 5 years and no mention of her existence before that. It was as if she had been created out of thin air, as if someone had meticulously erased every trace of her past. Frustrated, he ran a hand through his hair, his jaw tightening, muscles coiled with tension. He needed answers. If Sophia had disappeared 11 years ago, who had kept her hidden? Why had she resurfaced now? And why the hell was she pretending not to know him? His phone vibrated again. This time, it was Matthias, his best friend and business partner. Richard hesitated before answering, but eventually slid his finger across the screen. Where the hell did you disappear last night? The press is going crazy, talking about how you abandoned Elizabeth in the middle of the wedding. They say you ran after some waitress like a madman. Matthias's voice was casual, but Richard knew him too well to miss the underlying tension. Matthias, I need you to look into something for me. A woman named Isabella Garcia, Richard said, straight to the point. There was a brief silence on the other end. Isabella Garcia? Matthias repeated the name slowly, as if analyzing it, as if it sounded familiar. Yes, she worked as a waitress at the wedding, but there's no record of her. I want to know who hired her, where she came from, what she's hiding. Richard's teeth clenched, his fingers curling into a fist against his desk. I'll see what I can find, Matthias replied after a few seconds, but his voice was too neutral, too careful. Richard hung up without another word. A strange discomfort settled in his chest. Matthias had always been his right hand, the one man he trusted without question, but something about his reaction made him doubt. A knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. Mr. Evans, we have information, his head of security said, entering with an envelope in hand. Richard took it without a word and ripped it open. Inside was a photo, a grainy black and white image, captured by a security camera. Sophia. She was walking down a dark street, wrapped in a heavy coat, head bowed, her face partially obscured by her hair, and behind her, a man in a black cap followed closely. Richard's stomach twisted. Who is he? He asked, his eyes locked on the shadowy figure trailing her. We don't know. No matches in the database, his security chief answered, tension in his voice. Richard felt a knot tighten in his throat. Someone was following Sophia. Someone who clearly didn't want her to remember who she was. I want her found, no matter the cost. His voice was low, dangerous. We have a lead. She's working at a restaurant on the south side. We can go now, the man reported. Richard was already on his feet before he had finished speaking. The drive to the restaurant was torture. Every red light, every slow-moving car, every second that passed without him seeing her again only increased the desperation in his chest. He couldn't lose her again. When they arrived, the place was modest, small, far from the luxury Sophia had once known. Richard stepped out of the car without waiting and strode through the door with unwavering determination. The customers turned to look at him. His expensive suit and imposing presence stood in stark contrast to the simplicity of the establishment. But he only had eyes for one person. Behind the counter, stacking plates onto a tray, stood her. His breath caught for a second. Sophia looked up, and the moment their eyes met, the air grew thick, heavy. For a fleeting instant, Richard could have sworn he saw something. Recognition, a flicker of something long buried. But in a blink, it was gone, replaced by the same fear from the night before. She set the tray down on the counter and took a step back. "You can't be here," her voice was a trembling whisper. Richard moved toward her, slow, deliberate, his piercing gaze locked onto hers. "I'll ask one more time," he said, his tone both controlled and relentless. "Why do you keep saying you don't know me?" Sophia's eyes narrowed, her jaw tightening, but she said nothing. Richard pulled out the photo and placed it on the counter. "Who is he?" he asked, pointing to the man following her in the image. Sophia's gaze dropped to the picture. The moment she saw it, her face went pale. A slight tremor ran through her hands. "I don't know," she whispered, but Richard saw the lie in her pupils. "You don't know? Or you're afraid to say?" he pressed. The sound of a door opening cut through the tension. "Isabella, everything okay?" A deep voice echoed across the room. Richard turned his head slowly. Standing in the kitchen doorway, arms crossed, was a tall man wearing the restaurant's uniform, but he carried himself like someone who didn't belong there. "Everything's fine, Diego," Sophia replied quickly. Richard didn't need more to understand. This man wasn't just a co-worker. He was her guard. Or worse, he was the one making sure she stayed silent. The air between them grew dense, suffocating. "We'll talk again," Richard murmured, his voice firm as he took a step back. He left the restaurant, but his gaze never left Sophia's. His phone vibrated in his pocket. A new message. "We warned you. Keep searching, and you'll lose her again." Richard closed his eyes for a brief second, feeling his fury burn through his chest like wildfire. It didn't matter what threats they sent. It didn't matter who tried to stop him. He had waited 11 years for her. And this time, the truth would come to light. Richard hadn't closed his eyes all night. His mind was trapped in the image of Sophia at the restaurant. The way she trembled at the sight of the photo, the fear in her eyes, and the man watching over her with a possessiveness that left no doubt. He wasn't just a co-worker. He was someone ensuring she didn't remember, someone keeping her under control. He pushed away from his desk and walked toward the window of his office, his hands clenched into fists. 11 years. 11 years without answers, and now that she was standing right in front of him, an invisible wall separated them from the truth. His phone vibrated on the desk. When he saw the name on the screen, his jaw tightened. "Matthias, did you find anything?" His voice was rough, impatient. There was a brief pause before Matthias answered. "Yes, but I think you need to hear something first." His tone was too neutral, too measured, as if he were carefully choosing his words. Richard had no patience for riddles. "Spit it out," he demanded. "Isabella Garcia doesn't exist. There are no legal records of her before 5 years ago. No family, no medical history. It's as if someone built that identity from scratch." Matthias paused. "But there's more. Someone's been watching you, tracking your movements. And not just anyone, Richard. Professionals." A chill ran down Richard's spine, but he kept his voice steady. "Who hired them?" "That's what I haven't been able to find out yet. But there's something else." Matthias hesitated for a moment before dropping the real bombshell. "Elizabeth has been meeting with people who don't want their names spoken. It looks like she knows more than she lets on." Richard closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. He had always known Elizabeth wasn't a naive woman. She was calculating, strategic, but he never imagined she could be tangled in something this deep. "I want proof," he ordered without hesitation. "I'm working on it," Matthias assured him before hanging up. Richard dropped the phone on the desk and exhaled. If Elizabeth was involved, this wasn't just about Sophia's disappearance anymore. It was bigger. But first, he needed to see Sophia again. Hours later, Richard returned to the restaurant, this time with a different strategy. He didn't storm in like before. He didn't show his desperation. Instead, he simply entered, sat at a table, and waited. It didn't take long for Sophia to notice him. Her hands tensed around the tray she was holding. Her eyes darted to the side, avoiding his. But Richard didn't look away. He knew she wanted to run, but he also knew she wouldn't do it in front of everyone. When she finally approached his table, her voice was barely a whisper. "You shouldn't be here. I'm going to keep coming until you tell me the truth," he replied calmly. "I already told you. I don't know you," she murmured, but there was a tremor at the end of her sentence. Richard slid an envelope across the table. "Open it," he ordered. Sophia swallowed hard. Her gaze locked on the envelope as if it might burn her fingers. Finally, with trembling hands, she lifted the flap and pulled out its contents. Photos, snapshots of their past, of them, their home, their wedding, a life she had forgotten, but her subconscious seemed to recognize it. Her breathing grew erratic. Her eyes filled with something Richard couldn't quite decipher. Fear, confusion, denial. "No," she whispered, gripping the paper so tightly that it nearly tore. "Yes," he said, his voice firm. Sophia took a step back, shaking her head. "Someone made you believe you're not who you are," Richard continued, his intense gaze never wavering. "I want to know who and why." Tears welled in Sophia's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "I can't do this," she said, her voice breaking, before turning and rushing away. Richard didn't chase her this time. He knew he had planted a seed. No matter how much she tried to push it away, the doubt was now inside her. But he hadn't expected that, as he walked out of the restaurant, a shadow would be waiting for him at the corner. "Stop looking for her." The voice was deep, threatening. Richard turned his head slowly and locked eyes with a man dressed in dark clothing, a scar running down his cheek. "Who sent you?" Richard asked, his tone unaffected. "Not your concern. This is your final warning," the man muttered before turning and disappearing into a nearby alley. Richard stood there, motionless, his mind processing what had just happened. Now, he knew Sophia hadn't disappeared by accident, and someone was willing to do whatever it took to keep her from remembering the truth. Richard scanned the photos on his desk for the 10th time, his mind working at full speed. Sophia hadn't disappeared by chance. Someone had taken her away. Someone powerful enough to erase her identity and make her believe she had never been his wife. But now, after years of uncertainty, the pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit. Sophia had reacted to the photos, which meant that, somewhere deep in her mind, the truth still existed. He just needed to find a way to make her remember, without putting her life in danger. He picked up his phone and dialed Matthias, his best friend and business partner. Matthias' voice was calm when he answered, but Richard detected an underlying tension, a slight hesitation that hadn't been there before. "I need to see you." "Now," Richard said firmly. "Is this about Sophia?" Matthias asked without pretense. Richard clenched his jaw. "Yes, and I want the truth. Everything you know." Matthias was silent for a moment before sighing. "Meet me at my office in an hour." Richard hung up without another word. His instincts told him Matthias knew more than he was admitting. When he arrived at the company, Matthias greeted him with his usual unreadable expression, but Richard wasn't in the mood for games. "How much do you know about Sophia's disappearance?" His voice was low, dangerous. Matthias held his gaze before answering. "I tried to warn you, Richard," he said calmly, "but you didn't want to listen." A cold sensation ran through Richard's veins. "Warn me about what?" Matthias stood slowly, closing the office blinds before continuing. "Sophia didn't disappear on her own. Someone made her disappear. Someone who was afraid of what she knew." Richard felt his breathing turn heavy. "Who?" Matthias met his gaze before saying a name Richard never expected to hear. "Elizabeth." The impact was immediate, like a punch to the chest. "That's impossible," Richard murmured, shaking his head. "Is it?" Matthias narrowed his eyes. Elizabeth was never the woman you thought she was. When Sophia started asking questions about the company, when she uncovered suspicious transactions, she became a problem. And you know how Elizabeth deals with problems. A cold rage spread through Richard's body. Are you telling me Elizabeth made Sophia disappear to keep her out of her business? Matthias nodded. I'm telling you, Sophia got closer to the truth than any of us imagined. And Elizabeth made sure she was gone before she could talk. Richard felt the ground shift beneath his feet. His fiancée, the woman he had been about to marry, not only had lied to him but could also be responsible for stealing Sophia from him for all these years. Where does Sophia fit into all this now? He asked through clenched teeth. Matthias looked out the window, his expression grim. If Elizabeth suspects that she's starting to remember, she'll make her disappear again. Richard didn't hesitate. He grabbed his phone and walked out of the office without looking back. His next stop was the restaurant where Sophia worked. When he arrived, he saw her from a distance, wiping down a table with mechanical movements as if she were in another world. Her face reflected exhaustion, but there was something different in her eyes. Doubt. He approached with steady steps, but this time, he didn't try to pressure her. He didn't try to force her to remember. Instead, he slid a note onto the table beside her and spoke in a calm tone. If, deep down, something feels wrong, if a part of you knows that not everything is as you've been told, meet me at this place tonight. I promise I just want to give you answers. Sophia looked at the note warily, but Richard noticed the slight tremor in her hand as she took it. Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked away. Hours later, sitting in the dim light of his private office, Richard reviewed the information Matthias had sent him. Documents, emails, transfers. Elizabeth had moved a significant amount of money the same week Sophia disappeared. Funds that had been transferred to accounts impossible to trace. When the clock struck 9, Richard's heart pounded. Sophia hadn't come. He checked his phone, refreshed his messages. Nothing. But then, just as he was about to lose hope, the door creaked open. Sophia was there. Richard stood up immediately, his pulse hammering in his chest. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly. Sophia remained at the threshold, confusion and determination warring on her face. "If you lied to me, if this is some kind of game, I'll walk out and you'll never see me again," she warned. Richard nodded, holding her gaze. "Then let's start with the truth." Richard watched Sophia in silence as she stood at the entrance to his office, a mix of fear and determination in her eyes. He had waited years for this moment, to see her again, to get answers. But now that she was here, so close yet still so distant, he didn't know where to begin. "If you're here, it means part of you has doubts," he said calmly, carefully measuring his words. Sophia lowered her gaze, her trembling fingers clutching the edge of her coat. "I don't understand why you keep chasing me, why you insist that I'm someone I don't remember being," she murmured, her voice tense but not as certain as before. Richard pulled an envelope from his desk and slid it toward her. "Because the truth doesn't disappear just because someone tries to hide it," he whispered. Sophia hesitated before taking the envelope and opening it. Her eyes scanned the images inside. Photographs of their wedding, of her past life, of moments that felt strangely familiar but that her mind refused to accept. Then, she found a document, a medical report dated 11 years ago. "You were admitted to a private clinic after an accident. You were unconscious." But the name on the records wasn't Sophia Evans. It was Isabella Garcia, Richard explained, his voice taut. Sophia felt her stomach twist. "Are you saying that someone made me forget?" "Someone made you disappear," Richard corrected, his jaw clenched. "And now I know who it was." Sophia let the papers fall onto the table, her mind spinning in 1,000 directions. Fuzzy images flashed through her head. A white room, the sound of a heart monitor, a voice whispering her new name. Her breathing grew rapid, as if the ground beneath her was crumbling. Richard stood and approached her cautiously. "I know this is a lot, but there's something else you need to know," he murmured. "Elizabeth, she was involved in your disappearance. She orchestrated everything to erase your past, to take you away from my life." The name hit Sophia like a punch to the chest. Something inside her clicked into place. "I knew her," she whispered, Richard nodded. She knows you're remembering, and she won't just stand by and let it happen. Sophia felt chills run down her spine. If that's true, then my life is still in danger. That's why we can't let her control the story, Richard said firmly. Sophia held his gaze, still full of doubts but, for the first time, feeling like the truth was within her reach. What do you want to do? Richard pulled out his phone and dialed a number. It's time to end this. Hours later, at Elizabeth's charity gala, the flashing cameras lit up the grand entrance of the lavish ballroom. High-profile guests toasted, unaware of the storm about to unfold. Elizabeth moved through the crowd with her usual confidence, but her smile faded the moment she saw Richard enter, with Sophia by his side. The murmurs began instantly. Everyone in the room recognized her. The resemblance to the woman in the old photos was undeniable. "You thought you had buried her forever," Richard said, approaching Elizabeth with an icy glare. For the first time, Elizabeth lost her composure. "I don't know what you're talking about," she tried to say, but her voice wavered. Sophia stepped forward. "I do." The journalists stirred, their cameras recording every word. Richard pulled out a document and held it up. "This is a financial report proving that the same week Sophia disappeared, you transferred millions to a private clinic." His voice echoed through the hall. "You paid for her silence. You erased her past and turned her into someone else." The color drained from Elizabeth's face. "That doesn't prove anything," she spat, but it was already too late. Sophia took another step forward, her gaze unwavering. "You stole my life, but you won't steal the truth." At that moment, a group of officers entered the ballroom. "Ms. Wilson, we have a warrant for your arrest," one of them announced. The room fell silent. Elizabeth looked around, searching for a way out, but there was none. Richard took Sophia's hand as the police led Elizabeth away. "We got back what was stolen from us." Sophia exhaled slowly, her heart pounding. "There's still so much I don't remember," she whispered. Richard looked at her softly. "Then let's take the time to remember, together." And for the first time in 11 years, Sophia felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. Thank you for listening to this incredible story until the end. If you enjoyed it, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. We also suggest watching the video that appears on the screen so you can discover other amazing stories, because I guarantee you'll be surprised.